Prices of bread, cooking oil, meat, milk, and fresh vegetables are about to start rising. And this time, the warning is coming directly from the Prime Minister. In a recent statement, Keir Starmer warned that the war involving Iran and the growing tensions in the Middle East are beginning to affect the UK economy. The UK's food system is deeply connected to global energy markets, international shipping routes, and agricultural supply chains. When instability spreads across key regions of the world, those systems begin to shake. In this video, we'll walk through the key grocery categories he warned about. Understanding these warning signs now helps families prepare before the full impact is felt. And the last on our list is already affecting the cost of living for millions of households across the UK. Bread, why the Prime Minister warns. Staple foods could get more expensive. Bread is one of the most basic foods in the United Kingdom. Across the country, millions of households buy it every single week. From packed lunches to breakfast toast and evening sandwiches, bread remains one of the most common staples in the British diet. But what many shoppers don't see is that the price of bread is closely tied to something much bigger: the global wheat market. And wheat is one of the first commodities to react whenever geopolitical instability begins to affect the global economy. Because wheat doesn't just feed one country, it is traded globally, and its price moves depending on what is happening across multiple regions of the world. The UK produces a significant amount of wheat domestically, but it still depends on international trade to balance supply. Each year, the country imports millions of tons of wheat and wheat products to meet demand and to maintain stable supply for food manufacturers. At the same time, British flour mills and bakeries are closely connected to global grain markets. When wheat prices move internationally, those shifts are often reflected in the cost of flour used by bread producers, and global wheat prices have already shown how sensitive they are to international conflict. When the war in Ukraine disrupted major grain exports in 2022, wheat prices surged across global markets almost overnight. Countries that rely on imported grains suddenly faced higher costs, and food manufacturers had to absorb or pass on those increases. The same pattern is what analysts begin watching whenever new geopolitical tensions appear. Because grain markets react quickly to uncertainty, traders begin adjusting prices based on risk. Export routes can become less predictable, and food producers start preparing for the possibility of higher input costs. For something like bread, a food produced in massive quantities every day, even small changes in wheat prices can eventually ripple through the supply chain. Mills pay more for grain, bakeries pay more for flour, and over time the price on the supermarket shelf can slowly move upward. This is why staple foods like bread are often among the first grocery items economists watch when governments warn about economic pressure during global conflicts. As the Prime Minister suggested in his warning, the concern isn't just the conflict itself, it's the ripple effect through global markets that can eventually reach households. Because the next category involves an ingredient that quietly appears in hundreds of supermarket products, and when its price moves, it can push up the cost of far more foods than most people realize. Cooking oils. Why fertilizer disruptions could slowly raise prices. One of the warnings economists began watching after Prime Minister Keir Starmer spoke about the economic risks of the Iran conflict involves something most shoppers never see: fertilizer prices. As the tensions rise in the region, Iran warned that vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz could face restrictions or disruption. That narrow waterway is one of the most important shipping routes in the world. But the concern here isn't just oil. Large volumes of global fertilizer exports also move through the Gulf region. Countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are major producers of fertilizers used by farmers across the world. When the possibility of shipping disruptions appears in that region, fertilizer markets react quickly. Traders begin pricing in the risk, export shipments become uncertain, and fertilizer costs start moving upward. That matters directly to the foods used to produce cooking oils. Crops such as sunflower, rapeseed, and soybeans require significant fertilizer to grow properly and produce strong harvests. Without enough fertilizer, yields drop and production becomes more expensive. So when fertilizer prices rise, the cost of growing oilseed crops rises as well. But unlike wheat or bread, the effect here takes time to show up. Farmers purchase fertilizer months before planting crops. Higher fertilizer prices today usually affect the next harvest season, which means the pressure builds slowly in the background. Eventually, farmers face higher production costs for oilseed crops. Oil processors then pay more for those crops, and the oils produced from them, sunflower oil, vegetable oil, rapeseed oil, begin to rise in price. Cooking oils are used far beyond just frying or salad dressings. They appear in hundreds of supermarket products, including crisps, baked goods, sauces, ready meals, and processed foods. So when oil prices move upward, the ripple effect spreads quietly across a wide range of grocery items. This is one of the slower economic signals analysts watch when governments warn about global instability affecting everyday costs. But fertilizer pressure on oilseed crops is only one part of the food system. The next grocery category depends on something farmers must buy constantly in order to raise animals. And when that cost moves, supermarket meat prices rarely stay stable for long. Meat and chicken: why feed costs could raise prices in the UK. Chicken, beef, and pork might be raised on British farms, but the feed used to grow those animals often comes from outside the country. Two of the most important ingredients in livestock feed are corn and soybeans. Soybean meal in particular is a critical source of protein used to raise poultry and pigs efficiently. And here's the part many shoppers don't realise. The UK imports the majority of its soybean feed, with large volumes coming from global commodity markets through European ports. Even corn used in feed can be influenced by international prices, because UK farmers often buy grain that is tied to those global markets. That means British livestock farming is directly exposed to changes in global feed costs. When prices for corn and soybeans rise, the cost of raising animals in the UK rises with them. For poultry producers, feed can make up around 60% of total production costs. Chickens must be fed every day, and farmers cannot simply reduce feed without affecting growth and meat quality. So when feed becomes more expensive, farmers feel it almost immediately. At first, they try to absorb the increase, but over time, those higher costs move through the supply chain. Poultry farms pay more to feed their birds, processors pay more to buy chickens, supermarkets eventually pay more to stock meat products, and that's when shoppers begin noticing the change. Chicken breast, minced beef, and pork cuts slowly begin creeping upward in price. For families across the UK, meat is one of the most common items in the weekly shop. Even small increases can add up quickly when households are buying chicken or beef several times a week. This is exactly the type of chain reaction government advisors are watching when they warn that global tensions can affect domestic living costs. Even if the conflict itself is thousands of miles away, the systems that supply food to British supermarkets are connected to international commodity markets. And when those markets move, British farmers and British shoppers both feel the impact. But livestock feed is only one part of the grocery system, because the next category depends heavily on something that touches almost every farm and every supermarket. When energy costs begin rising, the effect spreads quickly across dairy products. Milk, cheese, and butter: how rising electricity costs could push dairy prices up. Milk, cheese, and butter depend heavily on refrigeration, and refrigeration depends on electricity. Across the UK, dairy farms store freshly collected milk in large cooling tanks that must run constantly to keep the milk from spoiling. These refrigeration systems operate 24 hours a day, drawing significant electricity. That cost has already become a concern across the UK economy. Over the past few years, businesses and households across Britain have been dealing with rising electricity tariffs. Energy prices have been one of the biggest drivers behind the broader cost of living pressures many families have complained about. Dairy farmers feel that pressure as well. Cooling milk on farms, storing dairy products in processing facilities, and keeping supermarket refrigerators running all require continuous electricity. When electricity prices rise, those systems immediately become more expensive to operate. For dairy producers, that increase shows up directly in production costs. Farmers pay higher electricity bills to run milk cooling equipment. Dairy plants pay more to operate large refrigeration systems. Supermarkets spend more keeping dairy sections cold throughout the day. Eventually, those costs begin appearing in retail prices. Milk, cheese, and butter gradually become more expensive on supermarket shelves as producers and retailers adjust to higher operating costs. This is one of the economic pressures being watched closely after the Prime Minister warned that global tensions could add further strain to the UK's already sensitive cost of living environment. Energy costs affect almost every part of the food system, and dairy is one of the most electricity-dependent categories in the grocery store. But refrigeration costs are only part of the picture. Moving on to one of the most important factors across the UK. Fresh vegetables: how global rising oil prices can quickly push prices up. One of the fastest ways global conflict reaches supermarket shelves is through oil prices. Right now, tensions involving Iran are centered around one of the most important oil regions in the world, the Persian Gulf. Countries in that region produce a significant share of global oil supply, and much of it moves through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the busiest energy shipping routes on Earth. When tensions rise there, oil markets react almost immediately. Even the risk of disruption can push prices upward. At different points during recent Middle East tensions, analysts have warned that global oil prices could climb sharply, sometimes jumping tens of dollars per barrel if supply fears increase. And because oil is traded globally, those price movements quickly spread across energy markets. The UK does produce some oil from the North Sea, but it still imports large amounts of crude oil and refined fuels. That means the country is directly exposed to changes in global oil prices. When oil prices rise, diesel prices usually follow. And diesel is the fuel that powers the trucks moving food across Britain. That's where the impact begins reaching supermarkets. Transport companies moving food across the UK rely on diesel-powered lorries to deliver goods from ports, farms, and distribution centres to retail stores. When diesel becomes more expensive, the cost of running those fleets rises quickly. Those higher costs then pass through the food supply chain. Distributors charge more to move products, supermarkets pay more for deliveries, and eventually the prices on shelves begin adjusting. Fresh vegetables are often among the first grocery items to react. Unlike packaged foods that can sit in storage for long periods, vegetables move through the system quickly. Supermarkets depend on regular deliveries of produce to keep shelves stocked. Many vegetables sold in the UK, such as tomatoes, peppers, and lettuce, also travel long distances before reaching stores. Some are imported from southern Europe and North Africa before being transported across the country. When diesel costs rise, every step of that journey becomes more expensive. And because fresh vegetables move quickly through the supply chain, those costs can start appearing in store prices within weeks rather than months. This is one of the reasons government officials have warned that international tensions could add pressure to the UK's already sensitive cost of living situation. Oil prices influence transportation. Transportation influences food distribution, and fresh produce often feels that impact first. But oil and transportation are not the only pressure building inside the grocery system. If this breakdown is helping you understand what may be coming to supermarket prices, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because the next category depends on something even more fundamental. Fresh fruits, import and clearance costs could raise prices in the UK. Fresh fruits are one of the grocery categories where the UK depends heavily on imports. Bananas, oranges, grapes, berries, and many other fruits sold in British supermarkets often travel thousands of miles before reaching store shelves. In fact, a large share of fruit sold in the UK arrives from countries such as Spain, Morocco, South Africa, and parts of Latin America. That means fruit prices are closely tied to what happens at ports, borders, and import checkpoints. When global tensions increase, shipping and trade become more complicated. Cargo moving across international routes may face higher insurance costs, tighter inspections, and longer clearance procedures when arriving at ports. These changes may not sound dramatic, but they add costs at multiple points in the supply chain. Ships carrying food may pay higher risk insurance. Ports may increase inspection procedures for incoming cargo. Importers may face longer clearance times and additional handling costs. All of those expenses eventually get added to the price of the goods being imported. For fruits, this can have a noticeable impact because they are highly perishable. Unlike canned or packaged foods, fresh fruit cannot sit for long periods waiting for clearance. Importers often pay extra for faster processing and cold storage to prevent spoilage while shipments move through ports and distribution centres. Those extra costs accumulate quickly. Import companies pass the additional charges to wholesalers. Wholesalers adjust prices when selling to supermarkets. Supermarkets eventually reflect those increases on store shelves. That's when shoppers begin noticing that items like grapes, berries, or citrus fruits cost more than they did just weeks earlier. This is one of the ripple effects analysts consider when government leaders warn about international instability affecting the domestic economy. Even when the conflict is far from the UK, the country's reliance on imported food means disruptions in global trade can eventually reach British supermarkets. And fruit imports are one of the clearest examples of how those pressures travel from international shipping routes to the price tags shoppers see in the produce aisle. Rice, Why a global supply shock could raise prices in UK stores. Rice is one of those foods many people assume is widely available everywhere. It appears in takeaway meals, home cooking, ready meals, and supermarket shelves across the UK. For millions of households, it's a regular part of the weekly shop. But here's the surprising part. Very little of that rice is produced in the UK. The vast majority of rice sold in British supermarkets arrives from overseas. Countries such as India, Pakistan, Thailand, and Vietnam supply large volumes that eventually make their way into UK grocery stores. That means the price of rice in Britain depends heavily on what happens outside the country. When global supply becomes unstable, imported foods like rice are often among the first to feel the pressure. Over the past few years, several major rice-producing countries have already tightened exports at different points in order to protect their own domestic supply. When that happens, the amount of rice available on the global market shrinks. Importers then compete for smaller supplies. Prices begin rising. Now add the current tensions affecting international shipping routes. Large volumes of food shipments travel through busy maritime corridors before reaching European ports. When conflicts increase the risk around key sea routes, shipping costs rise as insurers increase premiums and cargo companies adjust operations. For foods like rice that travel long distances by sea, those changes matter. Importers bringing rice into the UK may face higher freight costs, longer shipping times, or additional logistical expenses. Those costs rarely stay with the importer alone. Wholesalers pay more to secure shipments, retailers pay more when buying stock, and eventually the price of rice on supermarket shelves begins moving upward. For shoppers, this can be surprising because rice often feels like a basic, stable food. But the reality is that Britain's supply of rice is tied closely to global trade routes and international producers. When turbulence appears in those systems, whether through export restrictions, shipping risks, or rising transport costs, the impact can eventually reach supermarket aisles. That is why analysts pay close attention to imported staple foods whenever governments warn that international tensions could influence the cost of living. Because when a food that millions of households rely on every week depends heavily on global supply chains, even distant disruptions can begin affecting prices at home. How UK shoppers can prepare if grocery prices continue rising. After the warning that international tensions could begin pushing grocery prices higher, many households across the UK are asking the same question: what should we actually do about it? The goal here is not panic buying, but it does mean understanding which foods are more exposed to global disruptions and which ones are produced closer to home. Because when supply chains become uncertain, foods grown or produced within the UK are often more stable than those that depend heavily on imports. One of the simplest adjustments shoppers can make is paying attention to where their food comes from. Many supermarkets already label products clearly, showing whether items are British grown or imported. When tensions affect shipping routes or global markets, foods produced locally tend to face fewer disruptions. For example, the UK produces large quantities of potatoes, which remain one of the most widely grown crops in the country. Root vegetables like carrots, onions, and cabbage are also heavily grown by British farmers. These products travel shorter distances from farms to supermarkets, meaning they are less exposed to international shipping disruptions. Another category that often has strong domestic supply is oats. Oats used for porridge, cereals, and baking are widely grown across parts of the UK, particularly in Scotland. Because they are produced locally, they are less dependent on international trade routes compared with many imported grains. Some dairy products can also benefit from domestic supply chains. While dairy production still depends on energy costs, the milk itself comes primarily from British farms, meaning the country is less dependent on overseas supply for that category. Shoppers may also notice more emphasis on seasonal British produce in supermarkets when global supply chains tighten. Buying fruits and vegetables that are currently in season in the UK often reduces dependence on imported goods. That doesn't mean imported foods will disappear, but during periods of global uncertainty, local production can offer some stability. Another practical step many households take during uncertain economic periods is planning grocery purchases more carefully. Buying foods with longer shelf lives, such as oats, pasta, rice, or canned products, can help families avoid frequent shopping trips when prices fluctuate. Again, the goal is preparation, not panic. Government warnings about economic pressure are usually meant to help people understand what may be coming, not to create fear. But being aware of how global events influence everyday costs can help households make smarter decisions about how they shop and what they stock in their kitchens. Because the reality is that food systems today are deeply connected to international markets, and when disruptions appear in those systems, understanding where food comes from becomes more important than ever. The Prime Minister's warning about rising grocery prices highlights how events happening far away can eventually influence everyday life in the UK. From oil markets to shipping routes and global food supplies, the systems that bring food to supermarket shelves are more connected than most people realise. But understanding those connections gives people something powerful: the ability to prepare. If you found this breakdown helpful, kindly like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who does the grocery shopping in your household. Because staying informed about how global events affect daily life is one of the best ways to stay prepared.